Hello, my name is Richard Owen. I'm from the University of Glamorgan, and in this lecture I'm going to be discussing the European Union's institutions. There are four main European Union institutions: the Commission, the Council of Ministers, the European Parliament, the European Court of Justice, and there's also a Court of First Instance. Now, whereas the UK system of government has a three-way functional split between Parliament, the Executive and the Judiciary, it's a four-way split in the European Union, and each institution is meant to represent a particular interest. So the European Commission is meant to represent the European Union interest, the Council of Ministers is meant to represent the national interest, the European Parliament is meant to represent the peoples of the member state, and the European Court of Justice and the Court of First Instance are intended to uphold the rule of law. So they all represent a particular interest. Now, when we look at their functions, they can be fragmented across institutions. So the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council of Ministers all have a legislative function, and executive functions are shared between the European Commission and the Council of Ministers. I want to look first at the Commission. Now, the Commission currently consists of 27 members, each one nominated by a member state. So although they are nominated by member states, they're actually independent of national governments. And the Treaty of Nice set out reforms to slimline the Commission, because as we've grown from 6 member states to 27 member states, it's been getting very hard to find roles for commissioners. They've been literally running out of jobs for commissioners. Now, the Treaty of Nice created a 2-stage process for slimlining the Commission, and the first stage was reached in January 2005, because the larger states in terms of population used to have 2 commissioners, and in 2005 they gave up their extra commissioner. Now they have 1 commissioner. So whereas in the previous commission the United Kingdom had nominated Neil Kinnock and Chris Patten, in the current commission it has been Peter Mandelson and now Baroness Scott, the only nominated British commissioner. Now, the second stage of slimlining the Commission was meant to be reached when we reached 27 member states, which was actually achieved on the 1st of January 2007. When Bulgaria and Romania joined, they became 27 member states. But we have not yet seen a corresponding reduction in size of the Commission, as was envisaged by the Treaty of Nice. If the Treaty of Lisbon comes into force, and the first Commission appointed after the Treaty of Lisbon comes into force, there will be a reduction in size of the Commission, and it will be 2/3 the number of member states. Now, this is obviously seen as a shift in power, and possibly a shift in power from the small states to the large states. At present, each member state nominates a commissioner. So we have Germany, a country of 80 million people, nominates 1 commissioner. Malta, with a much smaller population, about 300,000 people, also nominates a commissioner. So the fear amongst the small states is that once you've got a reduction in size of the Commission, it's only the large states that will nominate commissioners, and they will no longer nominate commissioners. So to assuage the concerns of the small and medium-sized states, they said that although only 2/3 of member states will nominate a commissioner, it'll be rotated on a basis of equality. So every member state will be treated the same in terms of not having a commissioner, or a period when it doesn't have a commissioner. But of course, we're yet to see if the Treaty of Lisbon will come into force. Now, the Commission is headed by a Commission President, and his powers have been enhanced in the sense that acting unanimously on the basis of the Commission, he could sack an individual commissioner. And this addresses the so-called events of March 1999. The European Parliament can sack the entire Commission, but in March 1999 they were critical of two commissioners and didn't want to sack the entire Commission and found they couldn't do so. There was something of a standoff. In the end, the entire Commission resigned. So to prevent a repeat of the events of March 1999, the Commission President, acting with the Commission's approval, can sack an individual commissioner. Now, if the Treaty of Lisbon comes into force, there'll be a new role called the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. And this will be a merger of two existing roles. At present, the Council has their High Representative for Foreign Policy, and the Commission has their external representative, their external commissioner for external affairs. And this led famously to an American Secretary of State saying he didn't know who to ring in Europe. He didn't know who was really responsible for foreign policy matters in Europe. So to streamline the workings of the institutions, there's going to be what's called the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, which is a merger of the existing High Representative role and the existing Commissioner role, and he or she will straddle both the institutions. He or she will be a Vice President of the Commission and will also chair Foreign Affairs Councils of the Council of Ministers. Initially, this post was to be called the Union Minister for Foreign Affairs, but following the rejection of the Constitution Treaty in referenda in France and the Netherlands, it was thought they should take out state symbols from the Treaty of Lisbon and instead he or she will be called a High Representative, which is thought to better reflect his or her role because he or she will only be able to act on the unanimous approval of the Council of Ministers. Now, what are the functions of the European Commission? It has four main functions. It is the initiator of community action, has the so-called watchdog role, it is the executive of the community, and it has the representative financial and administrative function. So if we take each of these functions in turn, the initiator of community action, all legislation is initiated by the European Commission. So legislation cannot start at the European level unless it's initiated by the European Commission. The European Parliament can request legislative proposals. If the Treaty of Lisbon comes into force, there'll be a so-called Rights of Citizens initiative. So if you've got 1 million signatories, the European Commission will have to consider a legislative proposal at this 1 million signatories once, but it is not required to respond to the request from the European Parliament. The sole right of legislative initiative lies with the European Commission. And this is because of the ideas of institutional balance. Because each institution is there to represent a particular interest, each institution must have a role in the passage of legislation. Now, it's the so-called watchdog of the European Union. This is a twofold role. Under Articles 226 and 227, it can take member states to court, or has a role in taking member states to court, if they've breached EU law, and we look at that in greater detail in a separate lecture. It also has a role in enforcing European Union competition law. Now, since the expansion of 2004, its role is more to intervene in strategic cases, landmark cases, and it's done more now by national competition authorities, but nevertheless it has that power to intervene in national competition law cases. It's the executive of the community, but it shares certain executive powers with the Council of Ministers, but a lot of executive action is taken by the European Commission. And in fact, most legislation in the European Union is actually passed by the Commission, but it is delegated legislation. The powers have been delegated to the European Commission. And lastly, as a representative, financial and administrative function, it's representative function. It will represent the EU, say in World Trade Organization talks. As a sort of financial function, it administers certain funds, such as the European social fund and so on, and it has an administrative function. It's effectively the civil service of the European Union, more politicised than the UK civil service may be, but nevertheless it carries out that administrative civil service type function. So those are the main functions of the European Commission. If we now move on to the Council of Ministers, technically it should be known as the Council of the European Union. Its name was changed to that by the Treaty on European Union. The name hasn't really caught on. Most people call it the Council of Ministers, and in fact the Treaty of Lisbon refers to it as the Council of Ministers. So what are its functions? Well, it takes general policy decisions. It ensures the objectives set out in the treaty are attained. It ensures the coordination of the economic policies of the member states. Now, when it comes to legislation, it will either solely have the final say on legislation, or it will more often these days jointly take the decision on legislation with the European Parliament, the so-called co-decision procedure, which will be known as the ordinary legislative procedure if the Treaty of Lisbon comes into force. Jointly with the Parliament, it decides the budget on the European Union, and also under Article 308 of the EC Treaty, if the Council acts unanimously on a Commission proposal where it lacks a specific power to achieve a community objective, it can give itself that power. Now, what is the composition of the Council of Ministers? Well, it's not a fixed composition. It will vary according to the subject matter of the meeting. So it'll be a government minister from each member state at a lower level than the head of government. So if they're discussing finance, it'll be the finance minister from each member state, foreign affairs, the foreign minister from each member state, agriculture, the agriculture minister from each member state, and so on. So it's not a fixed body of people. Now, in terms of its presidency, at the moment there are 6-month presidencies. It's rotated through a process of 6-month presidencies. And generally member states look forward to being president because they will call meetings, and most importantly they will set the agenda for meetings when they hold the presidency. Now, if the Treaty of Lisbon comes into force, there would be an idea of a team presidency of 18-month duration. Now, as far as voting is concerned, at the moment they take qualified majority votes. The current qualified majority voting system allocates a certain number of votes per state, and the current system sought to give disproportionate power to the medium-sized countries, of which there are 2 countries of approximately 40 million people, Spain and Poland, and that's why they were both resistant to this proposed move to double majority voting under the Treaty of Lisbon, which was thought to benefit the larger member states. And increasingly, with each treaty amendment, more and more matters have been decided by a majority vote. So now there are relatively few matters which are decided unanimously. But agreeing a treaty amendment has to be decided unanimously, as does the accession of a new member state. And they're probably 2 of the most important areas. Other areas of unanimity tend to be in the field of foreign policy and security policy. Now, because it consists of a government minister from each member state, they obviously have to spend a lot of time in their own national capitals. To keep work ticking over in their absence, we have COREPA, the Committee of Permanent Representatives, which is the permanent representative, effectively the ambassador from each member state to the European Union. And there's a COREPA 2, which are the permanent representatives, and then more detailed decisions are taken at COREPA 1. So the Council of Ministers consists of a government minister below the rank of head of government. When the heads of government meet, that's what's called a European Council. So it's quite confusing. We have a European Council, which are the heads of government. We have the Council of Ministers, which is a government minister below the level of head of government. And this is to be kept separate from the Council of Europe, which is a separate organisation. So the European Council, they are supposed to give the European Union impetus for its development and define the general political guidelines. At present, the European Council's presidency is rotated in line with the Council of Ministers' presidency once every 6 months. Now, one of the most important changes that will be brought about by the Treaty of Lisbon, if it ever comes into force, is that there will be a European Council president appointed for a period of 2.5 years, and that will be a renewable term, renewable once only. So for a maximum of 5 years, you could have a European Council president. Now, if we move on to the European Parliament, and the purpose of the European Parliament is to represent the peoples of the member state. Now, since 1979, it has been directly elected. We're going to see that the European Parliament has steadily increased its powers with each treaty amendment. But what paved the way for this was direct elections in 1979, which didn't increase the powers of the European Parliament as such, but was a big increase in its legitimacy and gave it the confidence to throw its weight around more and to demand extensions to its powers. Now, the Treaty of Lisbon will fix the maximum number of MEPs to 750 plus 1. The Constitutional Treaty had set the figure at 750. Italy objected to having one member of the European Parliament less than the United Kingdom. So to get round this in the Treaty of Lisbon, they had the so-called 750 plus 1 formula, whereby the President of the European Parliament will not vote. So will be an additional member. Now, although we talk the European Parliament has been directly elected, one of the most democratic institutions, it's not pro rata elected. So a German MEP will represent more people than a Maltese MEP. And they're encouraged very much to sit in European political groups. So they won't sit in national groups. So, for example, the British Labour Party sits with the Socialist grouping, which consists of centre-left parties from all over the European Union. Now, what are the functions of the European Parliament? Well, it has a supervisory function, it has a legislative function, a budgetary function, it has certain special powers as well. So if we look first of all at the supervisory function, it holds the European Commission to account. And note, is the European Commission. The European Commission operates according to collective responsibility, so it can be held to account. It's much harder for the European Parliament to hold the Council of Ministers to account, because that consists of 27 governments with 27 different viewpoints. So it holds the European Commission to account. What powers has it got to do this? Well, it can sack the European Commission en bloc, but it can only sack the entire Commission. If we have events like we had in March 1999, where the Parliament was unhappy with the performance of 2 commissioners, it can't sack those individual commissioners, but it can sack the European Commission en bloc. Now, it approves the appointment of the European Commission. So one of the first things a European Parliament does is approve the appointment of a commission. And the terms of the European Parliament and the European Commission are meant to dovetail. So you have European Parliament take a new European Parliament in June 2009. There should be a new Commission in January 2010. So one of the first things the Parliament will do is approve the appointment of the new Commission. The Parliament debates an annual report produced by the European Commission. Commissioners answer questions before the European Parliament. And there are other ways that the Parliament can hold the Commission to account. It's appointed a European Ombudsman, it can set up temporary committees of inquiry, and it's also possible to petition the European Parliament if you're unhappy about any aspect of the European Union's activities. So that's the supervisory function. Now, if we look at the legislative role, well, this will vary according to legislative procedure. Every type of secondary legislation, regulation, directive or decision, must have a legal base. It must say which treaty article has given them the power to pass this legislation. And the legal base will specify the type of legislative procedure. Now, increasingly, that's the co-decision procedure. And if the Treaty of Lisbon comes into force, the co-decision procedure will be further extended and will be renamed the ordinary legislative procedure. However, for some issues are still decided according to the consultation procedure. All legislation will start with the European Commission, so you get a legislative proposal and the consultation procedure sent to the Council of Ministers. It'll be sent to the European Parliament, possibly also sent to the Committee of the Regions and the European Economic and Social Committee. The Parliament and the consultation procedure will send a non-binding opinion back to the Council of Ministers, and the Council of Ministers under the consultation procedure solely decides the legislation. It must get this non-binding opinion. In the case of Roquette, they went ahead and took the decision without the opinion from the Parliament. That was annulled for breaching an essential procedural requirements. They must get this opinion, but it's non-binding. There's a cooperation procedure used. However, its use now is restricted to financial measures, so I won't discuss it in depth, because the Treaty of Lisbon proposes getting rid of it entirely. But under the cooperation procedure, the Parliament can ask the Council to think again, so it can effectively force a second reading. But starting with the Treaty on the European Union, the co-decision procedure was introduced. Its use was extended in the Treaty of Amsterdam, and they made it easier in the Treaty of Amsterdam for the European Parliament to veto legislation. Its use was extended again in the Treaty of Nice, and will be extended again if the Treaty of Lisbon comes into force and be renamed the ordinary procedure. So how does the co-decision procedure work? Well, again, as with all matters, legislative initiative, it starts with the Commission, which will send its proposal to the Council and the Parliament simultaneously. The Parliament will give its opinion to the Council, at which point the Council will arrive at a common position, take a vote and see where they stand. The common position will then go back to the Parliament, which it can accept, in which case the legislation will be adopted, or the Parliament can reject it or propose amendments to it. Now, if you can't get agreement on this, eventually a conciliation committee will be formed. Conciliation committee consists of equal numbers of representatives from the Council and the Parliament, and the Commission merely mediates between the two. If you can't get agreement in a conciliation committee, legislation will lapse. So that effectively gives the Parliament a right of veto. Now, it doesn't work like a national parliament. If you make a comparison with British legislation is introduced in the Houses of Parliament, and the Queen in Parliament will take the final decision on the legislation. Whereas this structure is slightly different. You can't have sort of backbenchers introducing bills in the European Parliament. You always have to wait for legislative proposals to come from the Commission. For some matters, the assent procedure is also used, where the Parliament just says yes or no, such as for the accession of new member states, and cannot propose amendments. It just simply agrees, gives its assent, or withholds its assent. So that's the legislative process. Now, as far as the budgetary process is concerned, the Parliament's powers were extended by the budgetary treaties of 1970 and 1975, and the budgetary authority consists jointly of the Council and the European Parliament. The European Parliament at present can reject the budget in its entirety, so it can reject the entire draft budget. It also controls individual items of what's called non-compulsory expenditure, and that has been increasing. That's increased now to about 40% of the European Parliament's budget. However, the bulk of the budget is compulsory expenditure, used mainly towards agriculture. That's about 60% of the budget. The Parliament cannot control individual items of compulsory expenditure, but it can reject the entire draft budget. If the Treaty of Lisbon comes into force, then the Parliament will be able to control individual items of compulsory expenditure. Now, if we move on to the Court of Justice, I'll just briefly talk of the Court of Justice. Now, there's a judge from each member state, and there's no pressure to slimline the Court of Justice in the way that we talked about the Commission. They're trying to reduce the number of commissioners. With the European Court of Justice, the idea is you have one judge from every member state to You have the linguistic ability necessary to interpret the legislation, because legislation is produced in over 20 official languages. You have a representative from the legal tradition of each member state. However, they won't sit as a full court very often. They usually sit in chambers of 3 to 5 judges. Sitting with them will be an advocate general. There's no direct comparison to this in the British system. But advocate general is of equal status to the judge, will give a reasoned opinion prior to the judges considering their case. Symbolically, the Advocate General sits apart from the judges, although sits on the bench. And it was thought the idea behind this that when the Court of Justice was first established, it was a court of both first and last instance. So like it was like an inbuilt appeal mechanism. The Advocate General gives his opinion, and the judges give their judgment. The judgment is very different from that we produce from a British court, because all the judges have to agree, so it tends to be much shorter. And in many ways, the Advocate General's opinion is more helpful to us, because that is lengthy and reasoned, and we can see trends and so on better in that often than in the judgment itself. Another big difference between the Court of Justice and a British court is that they put much greater stress on the written proceedings. So obviously oral advocacy doesn't work so well in a plurilingual court. There's relatively restricted time given to oral proceedings. Now, because the workload of the Court of Justice has increased so much over the years, the Single European Act set up a court of first instance, and you can appeal on points of law only from the Court of First Instance to the European Court of Justice. In anticipation of the expansion to Central and Eastern Europe in 2004 and 2007, they've also got the power to set up judicial panels to help with their workload. And judicial panels are sort of specialist panels sitting in specialised areas, such as intellectual property law.